Liberalism as a political philosophy began to take shape in the 17th and 18th centuries, emerging as a powerful response to the absolute monarchies and rigid hierarchies that dominated Europe. Rooted in the ideas of individual liberty, private property and limited government, early liberal thought was shaped by Enlightenment thinkers who emphasized reason, secularism, and the belief that humans possess inherent rights. One of the most influential figures of this period was John Locke, who argued that all individuals are born with natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that governments must exist only with the consent of the governed. These ideas challenged the divine right of kings and laid the intellectual foundation for modern democracy. Liberalism at this stage was deeply concerned with personal freedom, constitutional government, and the protection of civil liberties, forming the ideological basis for later revolutions and modern liberal democracies. Liberalism in the Age of Revolutions marked a turning point where philosophical ideas began to translate into political action and the restructuring of entire societies. In the late 18th century, liberal thought became a driving force behind transformative events such as the American and French revolutions. These revolutions were fueled by the belief in popular sovereignty, the rule of law, and the protection of individual rights, core tenets of liberal ideology. In the American context, the Declaration of Independence, heavily influenced by John Locke's theory of natural rights, asserted that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The new American Constitution enshrined principles like separation of powers, representative government, and individual freedoms, giving liberalism its first large-scale institutional form. Meanwhile, the French Revolution radicalized liberal principles in the European context. The fall of the monarchy and the proclamation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789 expressed ideals such as equality before the law, freedom of speech, religious tolerance, and the sovereignty of the people. However, the French Revolution also revealed the tensions within liberalism, as the push for liberty sometimes spiraled into violence and authoritarianism, particularly during the Reign of Terror. Despite these contradictions, the revolutionary era marked liberalism's emergence as a global force, inspiring political change in Latin America, parts of Europe, and beyond. It set the stage for liberalism to evolve from a radical opposition to autocracy into a framework for building constitutional, rights-based societies. In the 19th century, liberalism matured into a dominant political and intellectual force, particularly in Europe and North America. This period saw the transition of liberalism from a revolutionary doctrine to a guiding principle of constitutional governance and economic theory. Central to 19th century liberalism was the belief in individual freedom, limited government, free markets, and the rule of law. Economically, thinkers like Adam Smith championed laissez-faire capitalism, arguing that the invisible hand of the market would lead to prosperity and innovation. Liberals supported the protection of private property and minimal state intervention in the economy, which aligned with the interests of the rising middle class and industrial capitalists. Politically, liberalism pushed for constitutional monarchies or republics, civil liberties, and the gradual expansion of suffrage, though often limited to property-owning men at first. Throughout the century, liberalism was shaped by ongoing struggles against the remnants of feudalism, absolute monarchy, and aristocratic privilege. In Britain, the Reform Acts extended voting rights, and liberal politicians advocated for free trade, religious tolerance, and education reform. In continental Europe, liberal movements often clashed with conservative monarchies, especially during the revolutions of 1848, which, although largely suppressed, revealed a widespread demand for liberal reforms and national self-determination. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill expanded the intellectual boundaries of liberalism, promoting not only individual liberty, but also gender equality and social reform. Mill's work on liberty and utilitarianism emphasized the importance of protecting personal freedom from both state overreach and the tyranny of the majority. As industrialization accelerated, some liberals began to recognize the need for moderate state intervention to address social inequalities and labor conditions, foreshadowing the later emergence of social liberalism. Despite its internal tensions and regional differences, 19th-century liberalism laid the institutional and ideological foundations of modern democratic societies. In the early 20th century, liberalism faced new challenges and underwent significant transformations as it responded to the pressures of industrialization, mass politics, and global conflict. Classical liberalism, with its emphasis on minimal state interference and free markets, began to be questioned amid growing economic inequality, harsh working conditions, and the rise of organized labor. The promises of liberty and prosperity seemed increasingly out of reach for large segments of the population, prompting a shift toward a more interventionist form of liberalism, often referred to as social or progressive liberalism. This evolution was particularly visible in Western democracies, where governments started to adopt policies aimed at improving education, public health, labor rights, and poverty relief. Thinkers like Leonard Hobhouse and T.H. Green argued that true freedom required not just the absence of restraint, but also the presence of enabling conditions, such as economic security and access to education, that allowed individuals to fully participate in society. The First World War had a profound impact on liberal thought. While many liberals initially supported the war as a defense of democratic values, the unprecedented destruction and authoritarian measures taken by governments during the conflict exposed the fragility of liberal institutions. In the aftermath, there was both a reaffirmation and a re-evaluation of liberal principles. The collapse of empires and the rise of new nation-states gave liberalism new opportunities, as seen in the creation of democratic constitutions in places like Germany and Czechoslovakia. At the same time, the interwar years saw the emergence of totalitarian ideologies such as fascism and communism, which positioned themselves as direct alternatives to liberal democracy. Economically, the Great Depression of the 1930s dealt a severe blow to classical economic liberalism, as market economies collapsed and unemployment soared. In response, economist John Maynard Keynes introduced a revolutionary rethinking of liberal economic policy, advocating for active government intervention through public spending and fiscal management to stabilize economies and reduce unemployment. This Keynesian approach would go on to shape liberal economic thought for decades to come, redefining the role of the state in securing both individual freedom and economic well-being. As liberalism adjusted to the realities of the 20th century, it laid the groundwork for the modern welfare state and positioned itself as a middle path between unregulated capitalism and state socialism. The rise of neoliberalism from the mid-20th century to the present represents a significant shift in liberal thought, marking a return to market-oriented principles, but in a new and more globalized context. After the Second World War, most Western countries embraced a form of social liberalism that combined democratic institutions with welfare policies, economic regulation, and strong labor protections. However, by the 1970s, this post-war consensus began to unravel due to economic stagnation, rising inflation, and a crisis of confidence in state-managed economies. In response, a new wave of liberal thinkers and policymakers began to argue that excessive government intervention was stifling innovation, efficiency, and individual responsibility. Drawing on the earlier ideas of Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, and later advanced by economists like Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, neoliberalism advocated for deregulation, privatization, tax cuts, and the reduction of state influence in favor of free markets. Neoliberal policies gained real political traction in the 1980s, with the election of leaders like Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan in the United States. Both pursued aggressive agendas to shrink the role of the state, break the power of trade unions, and open up national economies to global competition. Their reforms were celebrated by supporters as revitalizing stagnant economies and restoring individual freedom, while critics argued that they deepened social inequality and eroded public services. Neoliberalism soon became a global phenomenon, influencing the policies of international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, especially through the Washington Consensus, which prescribed liberalization, privatization, and fiscal austerity to developing nations. In the 1990s and early 2000s, neoliberalism continued to dominate global economic thinking, even under nominally left-wing governments, such as those of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, who embraced a third-way politics that blended market solutions with modest social programs. However, the 2008 global financial crisis marked a turning point, exposing the risks of deregulated financial markets and leading to renewed calls for stronger government oversight and economic justice. Since then, neoliberalism has faced growing criticism for contributing to income inequality, environmental degradation, and the weakening of democratic institutions. Movements on both the political left and right have challenged its assumptions, leading to a more contested and uncertain ideological landscape. Despite these challenges, neoliberal ideas remain deeply embedded in global institutions and policymaking, continuing to shape debates over the role of the state, the future of capitalism, and the meaning of freedom in the modern world. Criticism and contemporary debates surrounding liberalism, especially in its neoliberal form, have intensified in recent decades as many of its promises, such as prosperity, equality, and freedom, have been called into question. Critics argue that neoliberalism, by prioritizing free markets, deregulation, and privatization, has deepened economic inequality and weakened democratic accountability. As governments rolled back welfare systems and deregulated industries, wealth became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while many working and middle-class individuals experienced wage stagnation, job insecurity, and diminished public services. The dominance of market logic in nearly every aspect of life, from education and healthcare to housing and digital technology, has led to concerns that neoliberalism commodifies human relationships and erodes the social fabric. Culturally and politically, liberalism has also been criticized for fostering a form of individualism that disconnects people from collective identities and responsibilities. Some argue that liberal emphasis on personal freedom and tolerance, while noble in theory, can lead to moral relativism or social fragmentation when not balanced with shared values or civic engagement. On the right, populist movements have attacked liberalism for being elitist, globalist, and out of touch with the concerns of ordinary citizens, especially around issues like immigration, national sovereignty, and cultural identity. On the left, activists and scholars have pushed back against the structural inequalities that liberal democracies have failed to address, especially regarding systemic racism, gender inequality, and climate injustice. Technology has added a new layer to these debates, as liberal values such as free speech and open access are being tested by digital surveillance, algorithmic bias, and the unchecked power of tech giants. Platforms once celebrated as tools for democratization have been criticized for spreading misinformation, enabling manipulation, and undermining civil discourse. At the same time, contemporary liberal thinkers continue to defend the core values of liberalism: individual rights, rule of law, pluralism, and democratic governance as essential foundations of a free society, arguing that these principles need to be renewed rather than discarded. Some propose a return to more egalitarian forms of liberalism that emphasize solidarity, ecological responsibility, and economic justice, while others envision a post-liberal future that redefines freedom, democracy, and community in entirely new ways. The ongoing debates reflect a world in flux, where liberalism is not just a political doctrine, but a contested terrain in the struggle over what kind of society we want to build. The future of liberalism is being shaped by a rapidly changing world marked by political polarization, economic uncertainty, technological disruption, and mounting ecological crises. While some view liberalism as an exhausted ideology that has failed to deliver on its promises of equality and justice, others see it as a flexible and evolving framework still capable of addressing modern challenges. One of the central questions facing liberalism today is how it can reconcile individual freedom with the collective action needed to confront global problems such as climate change, pandemics, and the rise of authoritarianism. In response, growing number of thinkers and movements are calling for a reimagining of liberal values, one that places greater emphasis on solidarity, sustainability, and the social foundations of liberty. Some propose a post-neoliberal future in which the state plays a more active role in ensuring economic fairness, regulating markets, and protecting the public good. Ideas such as universal basic income, the Green New Deal, digital rights, and wealth redistribution are being discussed not as radical alternatives, but as necessary updates to liberalism's moral and institutional commitments. There is also a renewed focus on strengthening democratic participation, combating disinformation, and rebuilding trust in public institutions. At the same time, the global resurgence of authoritarian populism has pushed liberal democracies to defend their core principles, rule of law, freedom of expression, judicial independence, against internal and external threats. Technology will play a critical role in shaping the direction of liberalism. The challenge lies in harnessing innovation without surrendering privacy, autonomy, and equality to the unchecked power of corporations or surveillance states. As debates continue over how to regulate artificial intelligence, digital platforms, and data ownership, liberalism must adapt to ensure that technological progress serves human dignity rather than undermines it. Ultimately, the future of liberalism may depend on its ability to become more inclusive, responsive, and globally conscious, balancing individual rights with collective responsibilities and economic dynamism with social cohesion. Whether it evolves into a revitalized force for democratic renewal or fades in favor of new paradigms will be determined by how effectively it responds to the defining issues of the 21st century.